Hello, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to this special panel conversation from the SBS Assyrian program for the Naiduk Week. My name is Ninos Emmanuel, and I'm the acting executive producer of SBS Assyrian, where our studios are located on the Kamarigal land. I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land, elders past, present, and emerging. Since we are meeting on Zoom, I'd like to invite our panelists to acknowledge the land that they are joining this Zoom meeting from as well. Daniel?
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of Talawalada, the land around the Sydney Basin of the Gadigal people, and pay my respects to elders past and present. I extend respect to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, which we are residing on today.
Diana?
I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Gadigal and Bidjigal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm talking to you today, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging.
Lolita?
Hello, I'm joining this Zoom meeting from the lands of the Darug and the Eora peoples. I want to pay my respects to the traditional owners of those lands, elders past, present, and future, and acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded.
Each year, Naiduk Week celebrates the history, culture, and achievements of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. And the theme for this year is Always Wise, Always Will Be. It's a reminder that the First Nations people of Australia have lived on these lands for over 65,000 years. Naiduk Week is usually celebrated in July, but due to the COVID-19, the celebration takes place from the 8th to the 15th of November. Today, we've come together to discuss the ULURU Statement from the Heart, which came from an unprecedented national Indigenous dialogue to determine how Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples want to be recognized in the Constitution. In the SBS Assyrian program, we think it's important to talk to our community and listeners about the importance of this statement and to hopefully begin a dialogue within our community about how we as Assyrians and Indigenous people from Mesopotamia, now called Iraq, can support Indigenous communities here in Australia. Allow me to say that I'd like to introduce our panelists, three young, passionate Assyrians who I have the pleasure of having them on this panel. Dr. Daniel Tower is a scholar and an engineer. Ms. Diana Hezekiel is the production manager for NITV News and Current Affairs team. She has been working there for over 7 years. Ms. Lolita Emmanuel is a musician, musicologist, and teacher currently at the University of Sydney. Her current focus as a researcher and pianist is in the Assyrian music, and as a singer, she has collaborated with many hip-hop artists across Australia. And also, I'd like to mention that Lolita Emmanuel is my daughter. In a moment, we will be hearing from each of our panelists about their perspectives on why it is important for our community to support First Nations communities in Australia. First, I would like to pass it on to Daniel, who is going to tell us a little more about the Uluru Statement from the Heart. Daniel.
Thank you very much, Ninos, for that introduction. I'd like to start off by briefly discussing sort of the format of the Uluru Statement and understanding that it's an invitational statement for the country to participate in what the Yolngu called Makarata. The statement lists the Makarata as the process to which negotiation between Indigenous peoples and the colonial government can interact, as well as the people that cohabitate here in this land, for a process of healing in the midst of historical and present trauma. The idea behind it is that there is a mutual respect generated from a reinterpretation of history from the peoples who have suffered within this system and from the peoples whose voices have previously been unacknowledged. Us as Assyrians, we have a lot to learn from this process, and we have a lot here to celebrate together with the Indigenous people of Australia. Assyrians, we are Indigenous peoples of Mesopotamia, and we understand the disconnections that can happen between people and our land or our atra when we are displaced, when we are not acknowledged, when our history isn't taken as fact, and when our suffering isn't thoroughly accepted and experienced by all on the land. We also have a connection between peoples and history, and sacredness is something that Assyrian identity is also based upon. We should support Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders in this country, because not only are we people that are sympathetic to the needs of Indigenous peoples, we are here, diasporic peoples living in safety within the lands of Indigenous peoples who haven't been fully recognized. And I think that is a very interesting and important point for us as a community to start this dialogue. So one of the big relevant situations when being as a part of a diasporic community in Australia is that we fight quite hard and we are very vocal about the loss of Indigenous rights for Assyrians in northern Iraq. However, we have a long way to go in understanding the Indigenous rights and also the ideal situation to which we present within a country in which we have found solitude, safety, and peace. And I think that one of the most important aspects of this ULURU statement for the Assyrian community is to understand that it is much as an importance for us to fight for our own Indigenous rights as it is for us to ensure the Indigenous rights of the peoples whose lands we inhabit.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Doctor. Now I will ask Lolita to give her perspective.
Thank you. And thank you, Daniel, for that. That was really awesome. I also just wanted to say that I'm really glad that we're having this conversation within our community. What I'm really proud about is that I've noticed that there are a lot of people within our community who are starting to be vocal about the need to support Indigenous communities in Australia. And I'm seeing that a lot with younger people too. When I started to perform as a singer with hip hop artists, I started to meet artists who were rapping about Indigenous rights and culture and history and stories. And that's when I started to understand how much I was missing from my education and how much I needed to learn. Yes, we are noticing these parallels. We experience displacement, dispossession, loss of language and culture. The way that we experience them are very different. There are parallels between our community and First Nations communities, but they are quite different. And I think that's a responsibility that we should have as Assyrians living now on these lands. So we need to be responsible to re-educate ourselves about First Nations history. So rethinking what we know about First Nations communities, that can happen through hip hop too. I think most of us can agree when we say that a huge part of hip hop as a musical form is storytelling. We know that a really important part of hip hop is in the way that it gives a voice to marginalized people, and it's a way to express diverse stories, challenges, and frustrations that people who have been discriminated against have faced. And so this thing that we're talking about, that you mentioned, Daniel, in truth telling and kind of talking about history and making sure that we are clarifying so much about First Nations history, and because so much of that has been we've been quite misinformed. And so hip hop is like a vehicle that really allows for that truth telling. One really good example that I really wanted to mention was actually a song that was released earlier this year called I Can't Breathe. And it's by Dobby, shout out to Dobby, my bro. He is a Marawari and Filipino rapper, and Barker. So Barker also features in the track, and she's a Malyangapa and Barkanji rapper as well. And the title of the song, I Can't Breathe, it reflects the words that George Floyd, who was killed by police in the US earlier this year, they were also the words of David Dungay Jr., who was a Dungari man who died in police custody 5 years ago in Sydney. And it's a powerful song that tells truths. It's truth-telling, and it's about police brutality towards Indigenous people, and it's about Indigenous deaths in custody. And it's also Dobby and Barker's call to action as well, to demand justice for Indigenous deaths in police custody. And if we're thinking about the rates at the moment, the numbers, there have now been over 400 deaths since the 1991 Royal Commission into Indigenous deaths in police custody. And so what I want to say is that listening to stories like this through music is one of the many ways that we can actually understand the important aims of the Uluru Statement. And it's also an opportunity to hear diverse voices and perspectives.
Thank you very much, Lolita. Now we'll go to Diana, please.
Firstly, thank you so much, Ninos, for inviting me to have this conversation, a really important conversation that we all, as a nation, as a community, need to have. And I totally agree with Daniel and Lolita, what you've been saying about, you know, Indigenous rights, about Indigenous people, and the commonalities between us as Indigenous people and Indigenous people of this land. I'm probably going to talk to you about I'm going to go and talk to you about my experiences and how I got kind of started and how I came about and working at NITV and the importance of Indigenous people's voices being heard through media. So I guess my experiences started quite young. As a child, when I came to Australia, I was lucky enough to live in an area where there are a lot of Indigenous people. I went to primary school with kids that were Indigenous, and my education really started there with friends telling me about their lives and their stories. I mean, I didn't really learn from school per se, but more from the playground, and that kind of invigorated my wanting to learn about Indigenous people in this country. And then when I went to high school, we learnt about the stolen generation and what the Bringing Them Home report and what happened to Indigenous people during that period. And it was like an awakening moment for me, and I wanted to learn more. And I was lucky enough to 7 years ago get a job at the National Indigenous Television channel, and that has been a real education for me, and every day is really a learning experience for me. So I'm quite lucky to be there. And it's really surprisingly what's happened is not only have I learnt and gained knowledge in Indigenous Australians and First Nations people here, but I've also gained a better understanding of me as an Indigenous Assyrian, and learnt about myself and my community. So it's really interesting how that has happened. But the Uluru Statement, such a powerful statement, and a gathering of all these important Indigenous people that have come up with this framework. My understanding of the Uluru Statement, what they're essentially proposing is 3 elements: is reform of voice, treaty, and truth, which they've mentioned. And I think one important aspect is truth-telling. And Lolita, you were saying, you know, truth-telling through music and art. And I think there's many ways of truth-telling, and it does come through forms like performances, music, art, and media. And, you know, I think media especially is so important, an important part, because media representation, being able to see yourself being reflected, you know, we have those experiences too, you know, identity, all that kind of stuff kind of intertwines. And so I really want to talk about, media and how NITV came about and how important it has been, and other media organisations, Indigenous media organisations, as a way to educate Australians and the community about the struggles, about culture, and about the beautiful culture of Indigenous people, and trying to understanding that every Indigenous nation is different, and that it's very diverse, and they have multiple languages and histories and protocols. And so, I want to touch on that. So truth telling allows First Nation people to give their true history of this nation. Indigenous people were the first storytellers. It's important for us as a nation to hear these stories. Like I said, being told in many forms, through, you've seen the artwork that is all over Australia, and how amazing it is, and what stories it tells. And like you said, Lolita, the music that you hear, it's just amazing. And we're getting better, but I think at that time, it was very different. And so, that's where NITV stems from. It's a channel made by and for and about Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of this country. The other thing is, you can see with Indigenous media, and it's not just NITV, there are so many other, the great thing is there are so many other Indigenous media out there, and whether it's in WA with Galara Media and all these different media there, whether it's in the Northern Territory, whether it's in the Torres Strait, Queensland, all these important media organisations that exist and that help with this truth-telling process. So I think media portrayal and media representation as a idea of truth-telling, and as a way of truth-telling, because, like I said, they are the first storytellers, and being able to tell your story as a way of education, I think is quite important.
Now, we don't have much time left, but at the end, for conclusion, I would like to hear a statement for each one of them, a short statement, how we as a community, Assyrians, who have a parallel similarity, let's say, between us, the Australian Indigenous people, but how can we, the community Assyrians, work for or recognize more the Indigenous people of Australia? I'll start with you, Doctor.
Well, I think the saying goes, the more we know we don't know. And I think that we have been blind to the importance of learning about history and about interacting with the history of Indigenous peoples. So I think that a very first step is for people to not be intimidated by the field, and to take a genuine interest in country, in the Indigenous peoples and the histories of those peoples, not just in the last 200 years, more importantly, in the period between 200 years ago and 65,000 years ago, in the true country.
Lolita?
I think one other thing is to start start communicating and start learning. So definitely learning and making an active effort with that, but also listening to First Nations communities and listening to First Nations leaders and community leaders and organisers who actually do tell us how we can support different communities. And if you're on social media, there's a lot of avenues where you can find that information and get in touch with people. And I think, we can include that, we can share that on the SBS Assyrian page as well. But definitely talking to people.
Deanna?
Yeah, just get engaged. Go down to your local Aboriginal council, find out information, engage in media, learn how to be a good Indigenous ally. Some of the things that we've said is preference Indigenous voices, don't speak on behalf of Indigenous people. They can speak on their own behalf, be okay with not always being part of the conversation, be there for Indigenous people during the good times and the bad times. All these kind of things allows us to be good Indigenous allies, and also supporting Indigenous companies. There are multiple Indigenous companies out there, whether it is in fashion, in printing station. There's so many companies out there. So supporting them in that sense, and just do what you can to help and educate yourself. I think that's the key thing, is education, is getting an understanding, and that's the best way, and just walking together, I think. And that's the key element of the Uluru Statement, is supporting and walking together with the Indigenous people in order for us all as a nation to move forward.
I might actually add onto that, Diana. It also, it's NAIDOC week now, and it's a really important week to celebrate and listen. But I think that we should be equally as engaged beyond NAIDOC week as well.
For conclusion, I just have a question to ask, and that's open for all of you. How do we, as non-Indigenous Australians, support the campaign for reform? Can I start with you, Doctor?
Yeah, that's a great question, because it really provides the practical outlet to what the intention of the Uluru Statement is. And Assyrians are very aware of community support, and for lobbying for reforms, and for support from the government. So we have, a fair amount of people in certain areas who have quite a impact on local members and on policy within local community groups. As we put forward our own Assyrian agendas, it makes a lot of sense for us to include Indigenous Australians within those demands and within those discussions, as there isn't more legitimacy that we could seek for Assyrian Indigenous claims to be heard. Surely the lands in which we are thriving and safe to create those kind of discussions and demands should also be acknowledged in that same way. So I think that we have so many different avenues within our community which already do a lot of work on reform, on discussions with local and state governmental groups, that we can look to have one of those avenues to include Aboriginal, Torres Strait Islander rights and issues. I think, also from a perspective of music, Lolita may have a lot more to add on that, because community is so much more than just policy and government. It's also about expression. So I don't know, what do you think, Lolita? Do you think that there's anything that you would add to that statement?
Yeah, I think these practical steps that you just mentioned are really, really important. If you actually, you do kind of want to engage directly with the Uluru Statement from the heart, there are campaigns that you can engage with on social media too. I think the best place to start is on the Uluru Statement from the Heart website. There is an official website that I'm sure we can share. Reading the statement, understanding it, start talking about it with your friends, your khizmana, your family, and parents as well. If I'm talking to a young person right now.
I totally agree with what both you're saying, and especially Lolita. Yeah, the best way I guess you can support is to get involved, educate, go online, find out who your local Aboriginal council is, find out how you can help. Speak to people, go and view, go and listen to Indigenous artists, go and support Indigenous companies. I think there's many ways that we can help, and it first starts with having a conversation. Like you said, Lolita, having a conversation with your family, see what they think about it, having a conversation with your friends, and seeing how you can get involved, educating yourself. And it's not easy, and we'll all get there, and there are resources available for everybody. So, you know, it's exciting.
I just also wanted to say, like, and this is from personal experience, I mean, this is going to be an ongoing process. And I think that educating ourselves it's going to be up and down, and we're going to get things wrong, I think. And I think that's okay. And we should still, you know, and make sure that we continue to make these efforts. Because I think it's also about understanding that there are particular reasons maybe why we don't feel like we know enough about First Nations communities. Regardless of that, it's about kind of moving beyond that and just making that active effort. And the beautiful thing about the internet is that there's so much available, and there's so much, you know, appropriate kind of, you know, accurate and good information coming directly from First Nations communities too.
Exactly.
That's a really good point about getting things wrong, allowing yourself the space to understand something as fraught as Indigenous history in Australia, and as suppressed as Indigenous history in schools. It's no wonder we don't have more of a dialogue. That aspect is important. We can't be shy of talking and going to the bookshop, picking up Indigenous stories and reading them to your kids. We're in the land of, I'm right now in Talawalada, and that's where I am. You know, it's more than just Australia. It's one of the hundreds of nations that span back in this time. And maybe someone thinks that there's thousands of nations, or hundreds of nations, or tens of nations. Make the mistakes, have the conversation, start talking about it. And only then, really, will it be at the front of people's minds. And it should be.
I think that brings us to conclusion of this discussion that I saw very, very positive. And I hope that the message will go through and will reach as many people, not only here in Australia, from Assyrian communities, not only in Australia, but all around the world. So many countries do have Indigenous people, and we do have communities there. They will have the same understanding. Thank you very much to all of you, and looking forward to have more meetings like this in the near future. Thank you very much for all.
Thank you so much.
It's
great talking to you.
Thank you so much.